Well, hello to you and welcome to another episode of our Tulā Cultivate Community podcast. Really happy to have you here, really excited about this, and looking forward to speaking with more of you and sharing these great conversations full of knowledge and wisdom and sharing and experiences and storytelling and all of that, and having a really open space and platform for whatever comes up, which is just such an exciting thing in and of itself, and looking forward to that journey. In this episode, I talked to Karesse. I met her when I was taking photos, marketing photos for a yoga studio close to me here. And so I offered to them some photography of poses and of their team and of their teachers for them to put on their website or their Instagram or whatever it was. And I just so happened to meet her there, and I found her to be really lovely and warm and nice to be around. Great sense of humor. And she was very open to the fact that I wanted to take her photo, not only in the poses, but I wanted to take portraits of her as well, because I found her just to be really nice and open to that experience. And then from there, I've stayed, connected with her here and there. And I've only taken one of her classes at that studio. And on that day, it was a few things. It was International Yoga Day. It was Indigenous Peoples Day. And it was summer solstice. Yeah, that's it, because they all land on that one day. And I didn't really think too much about, that. I knew that was the day, and I was also just available to go to the class. So it wasn't specific to me attending her class based on any of those three things. And early into the class, she started, her teachings and speaking, and through that, she spoke to the fact that she carried Indigenous lineage. And I wouldn't have known, because she is white passing, similar to me. I am also half white, and I carry with me Armenian lineage. And when she spoke to that, it was very powerful, and I never forgot it, and I carried it with me, and I was even more impressed, and I really enjoyed her teachings and the way that she cultivated energy and brought everything to the class. And I thought, great teacher, love it, And then I had asked her to speak to me here in the podcast about Indigenous lineage and any sort of knowledge and education in her personal experiences in her family here. And I also wanted to talk to somebody about yoga, which I will want to talk to people about all the time. There's not going to be a time I don't want to talk about yoga. So I thought it was a great space for me to begin introducing a yoga teacher and someone who is carrying lineage and teachings as well. In this episode, we talk about those things. We talk about growing up in a family where we are white passing, but our family is not, and what that experience is like. We talk about BIPOC. We talk about language and safety in yoga spaces, and honoring yoga lineage as well, in areas where in both of these things there is a lot of cultural appropriation, and how we can do our best to change that, or kind of mend some of the issues to the best of our ability. We're trying to do our best, of course. So I hope you enjoy listening to this, and thank you so much for being here. Let's begin. Let's do this. Let's begin a little bit about yourself, and
Okay. Well, my name is Karesse. I have been a yoga teacher for almost 8 years. I I've taken a lot of teacher trainings in that time. And more recently, I would say in the last 5 years or so, I've been reconnecting to my Indigenous roots. My grandmother, who's the matriarch of our family, was Chehalis First Nation. That's based out of, like, our reserve currently is based out of Agassiz and sort of the Hope and kind of surrounding area in BC. And once she passed, my family sort of doubled down on trying to reestablish our connection to community. My grandmother lost her status in the 1950s. Okay, right. I'm not sure of the exact year. There's a lot unknown about that time.
There always is.
Historically, we don't know the exact date or per se, but because there's a stipulation in the Indian Act in Canada that states that if an Indigenous woman marries outside of her reservation, then her status is stripped from her, and she assumes whatever status her partner has.
Okay.
And because my grandfather was Lithuanian, he came over to Canada in the Cold War.
Right.
There was no status afforded to him. He was like a refugee, essentially, at that point. So not a lot was really known at that time, and my grandmother was very fortunate. She had avoided herself going to residential school, but her siblings went, and her parents went, and their parents went. And there's a lot of mixed information from our family around that. Having done some research myself and with my cousins, there's some impacts that I think we could agree is intergenerational trauma that's passed down.
Yes.
Some of that is lateral violence, which is essentially like turning violence to marginalized people instead of to the oppressor. Is essentially what lateral violence is. It's you're angry at the wrong person instead of the person who actually did this to you. And it can manifest in a lot of different ways. I think the way it manifested in our family was through sheer perseverance to be ignorant.
We
almost just like refused to acknowledge the trauma that had existed in our family, and instead my uncles and even some of my cousins are very much people who power through. Even in the face of trauma. And I think my grandmother was very much like that. I mean, she raised 8 kids. She was no fool. And I think if she would have allowed herself to maybe feel more of that trauma from her parents and her grandparents and her siblings' experiences, it might have been different. But she chose to sort of shut that out and unacknowledge it. To power through.
Well, sometimes, it's easier to forget, and and sometimes you do just forget because it's so traumatic, the brain just doesn't remember, and then to revisit that is opening up a big thing that you maybe don't even know exists.
Absolutely. And I think it manifested in my grandmother of being very dedicated to the church, which is also something we see in Indigenous communities, because of course they were taken from their families at a young age and sort of introduced to the church as the only way they could be saved.
This is the
only way that if you didn't believe this, you were going to hell. And when you tell that to a 6-year-old who's never been outside their reserve before, or been outside their land, or been away from their family, and you're telling them that the only way to be saved is to
now
believe this thing and stop speaking your language and cut all your hair off and and endure, then for some people that never leaves, right? They grow up and they believe that hey, if I don't do this thing, I'm going to hell.
The worst case scenario, the worst thing could possibly happen, and that also I find sometimes carries through in adults, just for doing the wrong thing, making a small wrong choice in your life, it's you didn't do this, you did do that, you cut someone off, really minimal things become really catastrophic because it was drilled into you, if you do this wrong, the worst possible thing is going to happen to you.
Absolutely.
It's hard to recover from that.
And so it's interesting because we grew up, I mean, we had a super, I mean, normal, I use air quotes here. They can't see me, but like air quotes. We had a super normal upbringing in childhood. I mean, I think every kid thinks that until they are an adult and they can look back on it with an adult, with an adult lens and then go, wow, that was messed up.
Yes.
But that's kind of, I think, how I came to yoga. Was there was something inside that wasn't quite right. And I don't mean like necessarily mental health wise, but there was just like a heaviness that seemed to settle in. And before I found yoga, I would say I was a very angry person. I had a lot of like rage with things, and I could never quite figure out why.
So maybe was it a little bit obviously from like it was suppressed because
and I think it was passed down as well. Like my grandma was a very stern person. I never knew my grandfather because he passed away when my mom was young, and my mom had inherited that same quick to anger that like my uncles and my aunts had.
Right.
And I think a lot of my cousins have the same sort of thing, which is we're very quick to be defensive and react very harshly.
Right.
And I just got to a point where I was trying to find out why.
Yeah.
You know, why do I feel this way? Why do I react this way?
Right.
Why is it me and it's not my husband? Why is it me and it's not my best friend?
Right,
like what was so different about their childhood and their upbringing that they don't have those same feelings?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I wasn't finding the answers I wanted, so the first thing I did was go to yoga. Because I was like, well, if I can't figure out why I'm this way, I can at least physically do something about it.
Yes, right.
And I had experiences in like corporate yoga and like capitalized yoga. I want to say it's like the colonized version of yoga.
Right.
And I knew I was looking for something deeper, so I started practicing pretty regularly. I was practicing early mornings before work.
Okay.
And at the time I was working a corporate construction job, so it was very stressful.
Yes.
Lots of hoops.
Yes.
And I was practicing about 3 times a week, every morning, and then sometimes on the weekends.
Right. And you were going to a studio?
Yes.
For that? Okay.
Yes.
Right.
And I got very lucky that actually the first 2 teachers that I connected with, and I'm sure this doesn't happen all the time, but both of them understood the depth of yoga. Like for them, it wasn't just a physical practice.
Right.
You know, like they were teaching the limbs, they were teaching breath work, they were teaching meditation.
That
like
does feel very lucky.
You know?
Like, you know,
it was.
doesn't always happen like that, you know?
And, you know, they would theme classes around, like, you know...
Yes, right.
You know...
Like ahimsa.
They would theme classes around it. So there was a certain amount of knowledge that was also being passed down that wasn't just, hey, like, if you work really hard, you can do headstand one day.
Right.
You know, it was very much...
But also the depth of getting the headstand, you know, because that's really nice when you connect with that whole thing, you know?
So I got super lucky, and through that, you know, I was pretty dedicated to my practice, and I asked a lot of questions, I think, and both of them had said to me, like, hey, you know, you have all these questions, you know, have you ever thought about taking teacher training? Right. You know, you don't have to become a teacher, but you learn a lot, right, in your teacher.
Yes.
And I said, you know, I hadn't thought about it, but maybe I should. And so I started kind of looking around and doing research and figuring out what I wanted to do. And I did a lot of research. I know a lot of people don't do that. They kind of like go with their yoga studios training.
Yes. Yeah, that's true.
And there was, don't get me wrong, there was pressure from the studio that I attended at that time to be like, hey, you know, we have a training.
Right.
If you're interested, kind of thing.
Give us your money.
Exactly. It's only $5,000.
Yeah, right.
But I ended up doing my own research, and I found a program in Gastown in Vancouver.
Okay.
And I went to that one, and it was actually what drew me in was there was extended hours.
Right.
So it wasn't just a 200-hour, like you got like a bonus 40 hours of training.
Which studio did you end up at?
I ended up at, it wasn't even a studio, it was just a school. So it was the Vancouver School of Yoga.
Wow.
I think they're now called the Vancouver School of Healing Arts, because they also do like massage therapy.
Okay, so
and
they
like
still
other...
exist. I'm familiar because my friend has gone there. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
And my teachers, again, I feel like I hit the jackpot here because a lot of my teachers actually no longer teach like that now.
Wow.
Like that was like their last full program, and then after that they like went out and did other things.
Right. What a way to know you were in the right place. You know?
Yeah, right. It was definitely simpatico. So my main teacher was Leela Rasa Brown, and she was fabulous. She actually had a bachelor's degree in anthropology.
Perfect.
So she knew a lot about like the actual historical values of yoga. So we weren't just learning like, here's what a warrior pose is.
Right.
We were learning like, you know, how different forms of yoga developed over like decades and historical periods. And we did a lot of teachings around like South Asian, specifically Hindu, like Hindu religion and methodology and origin stories of like gods and goddesses and a lot of like the creation story for Hindus and there was a lot of discussion around that. And I felt super privileged because, you know, when I spoke to other people who've taken trainings in other places, you know, being teachers, not a lot of students got that kind of information. And that was actually the part that was exciting to me.
Yeah, of course.
Me
too, actually. It opened up something, obviously. You know, I was like, all right.
Yeah, I was like, there's a uniqueness to this. This isn't just formulating poses together and like helping people achieve like a calmness within their nervous system.
Right.
I mean, there is a part to that,
of course,
but there's also this historical, you know, there's a significance here. There's a meaning.
Yes,
It's not meaningless.
Right.
It's not just science. There's something else there.
Yes.
And to me, that's always been like a point of curiosity, right?
Oh,
Like what's underneath the surface.
Well, and it's like endless, and that's what I love about it so much with yoga practice and in so many different areas of yoga practice. I always just feel like some of the part that draws people in and keeps them around in it for so long is that like there is no end point, even in just physical practice of poses. There's still no end point because like you could still advance the shape, you could still go a little further, you could still whatever, and then even in your philosophies, there's no ending to that knowledge.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting as well to consider that all of these started somewhere and how they've developed over a period of time. I mean, it's no different than when you look at like the origin points for like most religions.
Yes.
Like all religions stem from somewhere.
Yes.
There was some guy in a room somewhere who wrote some shit down.
I gotta let these people know.
I gotta tell them about my life-changing experience and now it's Scientology. You know, like whatever.
We could have done without.
Yeah, exactly. Dianetics. But just, you know, like just it's wild to see how those things have almost changed as they've been passed down, you know, through centuries and decades and, you know, even just day to day.
Yes.
How one teacher explains it is going to be different than how another teacher, you know, explains maybe the same thing.
Right.
And I was really interested in that part, and I really liked teaching. Sequencing was also something that spoke to me, but that's just like
I enjoyed that as well.
I have a type A personality, so I like for things to
go together
and fit and make sense.
Make it
like
good.
And I want students to have a feeling when they come to my class, and I don't necessarily care what that feeling is.
Right.
But I want what I've created in their body to mean something to them.
Yes.
So whether that's bringing calm, whether that's making them pissed off, whether that's it should evoke a feeling, some sort of there should be a reaction there, because if they're leaving my class and they're just like meh, then you know, I don't feel like I've done my job as a yoga instructor. I don't even know if I say teacher anymore, but
some people say like practitioner, facilitator.
Facilitator.
That's something, you know.
I don't know if I would define myself as like teacher level, because to me teachers are people who have like inherent wisdom. Right. And I know that's a very non-colonial way of looking at it, because when you look at like colonization versus indigenous or like native practices,
right.
we tend to view things in harmony,
right,
versus colonization likes to weigh things on scale and size and dimension.
Right.
So like you've taken a 4-year program, therefore you are wise.
Yes, exactly. You're right.
Whereas,
you're worthy of it because you've done that. Yeah, right.
Yeah, whereas like in an indigenous setting, and I mean, I can't speak to India, I've never been there, I don't have the privilege of knowing, but I feel like there's a certain amount of thing where they go, okay, you've attained a certain level of self-study, whether that's through years, working with a specific mentor, having valid experiences, and therefore we would view you as wise.
Well, and also your like energy about your life and your practices. Sometimes you can also just feel it out. You're like, I feel that this person like has great knowledge, and they're just born with like this wisdom to them already. That just takes a little bit of practice, because not everybody you meet is like, some people are pretty green, to life, and you're like, yeah, I wouldn't take advice from you. Like,
that's true. I think there's something to be said, which actually ties into one of my favorite things that I learned in my yoga teacher training, which is the creation story of Hinduism, and how the Atman and Brahman, and how we're all just a piece of the eternal, trying to return to the one, every time we live a lifetime. And every lifetime that we live, there's a certain amount of lessons that we're supposed to, gain, wisdom that we gain. And at the end of that life cycle, once we've achieved, all that we're supposed to achieve, we return to the one. Right. And that's, we come back to the eternal. Right. And it's interesting because when we say like there's certain people who are old souls, or who have seem to be born with a certain amount of wisdom already, and part of me wonders if that's because they're on their final life cycle, or they've been here before, absolutely, and they're bringing all of that wisdom from their past lives, and they're bringing that to their new life cycle, and it's hard being indigenous and not having a connection to like our own stories and our own traditions. I do a lot of research in my free time, and I'm really excited to enroll in some language programs coming up, and working with my cousins to figure out how can we best honor our lineage and like show up for that community. And I was saying to my husband the other night that I sometimes know more about other cultures and like their origin stories or their mythology, or done a lot of self-study in that, and I can't even speak to my own, because it was either wiped out, or it's held only by elders who are now much older and don't have the capacity to like speak in group settings. There's a sense of loss there, that I think is unique about, I guess, me as a teacher, is trying to bring that into the space. While also still honoring yoga as it is, because I never want to come into the space and be like, hey, I know that South Asian people have a claim to this, and they have ownership of this practice, but I'm gonna do what I want, and too bad for you.
Could you imagine?
I couldn't.
No.
So you want to keep the lineage there, but also, I guess, add your own experiences in.
Absolutely. Right.
And I kind of think that maybe that's what makes teachers or practitioners or whatever we want to call them.
What's the right thing now?
What's I know?
We don't know.
The yoga people. That's what makes a yoga person most authentic. And able to connect to communities when you can be vulnerable and share. Share your thing.
Absolutely. And like even for like me and my teachings, I had started also closing practice or beginning or whatever, with that I acknowledge that I am a white passing woman teaching the lineage of yoga. And then that felt when I came out of my mouth, because a lot of stuff just comes out of my mouth. I don't plan to say whatever at opening or closing, how that is. And I was like, I think I'm onto something here, and I was like, that felt really like big to say, and I remember when I first took your class, I wouldn't have known, of course, that you had any indigenous lineage, because as we were talking about before, just being like, white passing and what have you. And then when you spoke to that, it mattered to me, and I'd never forgot it. And I had only taken your class once, and I didn't forget that, you know, and how you brought that into the class, and those teachings, and bringing in that wisdom as well, just to like weave in really nicely with yoga teachings as well, right?
Yeah. And I think that speaks to, you know, honoring where we've come from, but also where we're going.
Yeah, right.
And, you know, where I'm going right now, hopefully, is deeper into my own culture and traditions, and hopefully opening doors for that to happen.
Yes.
But where I've been is steeped in, you know, South Asian culture, and like learning very honestly about the roots of yoga, and doing the best I can to honor those authentically, without putting a colonized spin on it.
It's very challenging. It
is,
you know,
especially in the West. I find, you know, I still see a lot of studios that work very hard to be like a capitalized money making machine. And I mean, I'm not knocking anybody who needs to make a living.
Yeah, we gotta survive.
You gotta pay your bills.
Right.
But I do believe that there's some yoga studios who are doing that really authentically.
Yes, right.
And really well.
Right.
Without harming.
Yes, that's true. Right.
Or at least from harming less.
Right.
And I find it interesting when I walk into certain yoga spaces, there are, and I think you and I have spoken about this before.
Yeah.
There are like certain, I don't want to call them red flags, but I guess that's kind of what they are.
I guess what it is. That's kind of what it is.
Yeah. There are certain red flags that kind of, as they pop up for me, that's what tells me that I'm in a colonized space, or I'm in, and I automatically assume, even as someone who's white passing, because I've made a commitment to honor the practice for what it is, and show up as, you know, an Indigenous person in this space, taking up space, and making space for other Indigenous people, that I'm not going to be safe there.
Right. Yes.
So I'm preparing myself, you know, mentally and emotionally for that impact.
Yes.
Because it often makes us, and I think anybody who does this makes this commitment, makes them an unpopular person in colonized spaces.
No kidding, right? Well, and I found like what I observed in myself and just in spaces, whatever, is as soon as I became a teacher or whatever it is, you know, I got the certification, whatever, that my experience in yoga spaces completely changed, and like the way I viewed it and the way it affected me and what I took on and what I left behind, whatever, it just shifted so much when I gained further knowledge and understanding. And I remember I took my first yoga class, like, after I had finished like my 200 hour, and I remember being like, I was pissed. I was really angry for the whole hour. I was like in class, like quiet on me. I was in my head, but I was like, I'm fucking so pissed right now. And I was really mad because I wish that I embraced my like last yoga class before like going to school and like whatever, because all of a sudden now I had this like completely different lens. And I was like, oh shit, like I know what's going on behind the scenes here, and I know like what their knowledge is, I know what they're doing, I know that they're like sequencing and they're structuring and they're this, they're that, the cues, like, you know. And it changed the space. But it also changes the space in like, in these deeper ways of like, oh wait a minute, I care to like honor this to the best of my ability and like with the most reverence and respect. And now I'm walking in these spaces and I'm like, oh man, like it makes me really angry, and I leave like usually really pissed off and upset about how it's being handled, you know. And
I've had those experiences too. I mean, I remember I followed this one yoga studio who shall not be named online for a long time, and mostly because I'd seen some really powerful teachers that I follow teach there. And I thought, oh, it'd be so cool to take a class there, you know, the next time I'm in Portland, because they're in the US. And so my husband and I went on a vacation, and he's a basketball fan, so we went to a game.
Love it.
And during the day I was like, great, I'm gonna go take a class. I'm pumped. And so I showed up, and it was probably like one of the top 5 worst classes I've ever endured. And the teacher did my least favorite thing ever for any teacher to do, which is they walked into the room and they said, what do you guys feel like doing today?
And
I was like, that's your job.
Right.
Like, I came here for you to lead me through a structured sequence that hopefully you designed with intention and thoughtful care, you know, for my physical body and my nervous system. And this is not the experience, you know, that I was hoping for. Right. You know, I don't feel like, you know, we should have to spitball ideas for your class,
no shit,
you know, before the start.
Well, especially just like a public class too. It's not like a bunch of really well-connected people all the time. It's just like, you know, and I find that some of my students are not that connected with their bodies. Like if I ask them, what do you feel that you may need tonight or whatever, like if you're welcome to let me know if you need a stretch, I'll just throw it in, whatever it is, you know, I'll take it and go with it. And I find that some people I speak to I just hear in conversation, like, they're not connected with their bodies enough to even really know what they need. And that question can be really scary and intense for people.
Yeah, and also, I think there kind of like you were saying, when you pull back the curtain, you can't unknow something once you know it, right? So exactly. So as a teacher sitting in another teacher's class and having them say that out loud to a group of students, to me what they're saying is, I didn't care enough to plan something
for you. Yes, right.
And this class is obviously minimally important to me. And to me, I just kind of felt like, well, why am I even here then? Because, you know, I've taken the time to show up and be committed. It's very important
to you. You've traveled, you know, like
and I just remember being so disappointed by that experience, and it really changed my perspective on, you know, studios that have a following or studios that are big, you know, in terms of branding and networking and you know, being like financially successful.
Yes, right.
Because there's still crappy teachers teaching there.
Yes,
you know,
absolutely. Right.
It doesn't necessarily mean that there are teachers that are honoring yoga the same way that I'm choosing to honor yoga.
Yes, right.
And so that was kind of like the bubble burst. You know, I was like, oh, not everybody thinks this is important as I think this is.
No shit.
And that was eye-opening for me. But I do remember being very angry leaving the class.
Right.
And I mean, rightfully so. There was no flow to the class. It was very choppy.
Also, you know, even then,
I didn't feel good after. My body didn't feel good. You know, you can always tell too. Like, you can read an energy in a room. I firmly believe that if you are a yoga teacher and you have any level of experience doing that work, like being in community with your students, that you can feel the energy in the room.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, there's been a lot of times where I've just completely like gone off of what I thought, of course, you know what I mean? Which is, it's fine for me. It does, you know, it's whatever. But I remember like I had a student who was like crying already when she kind of came in. You know, and my intention was like to start like seated and like, you know, whatever, just breathing, blah, blah, blah. And then I saw her and she told me like why she was upset, whatever. And I was like, okay, let's start laying down. You know, like, so let's just come into this restful position. Like, how could I have put her in this like upright thing all of a sudden when she really needed to be more, you know, within and like drawn in, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I feel the energy of a class too. Like I've walked into classes where I had a plan to teach, you know, a really strong, breathy, focused class, and I felt the energy in the room, and it was tired and slow and craving more stability and grounding, and I just went, cool, we're not doing this anymore, we're doing this. Because you can tell that a class is going to go over well or it's not going to go over well in terms of, you know, energy, at least. I mean, I don't think I can ever predict whether someone's going to align with what I have to, you know, say and offer. But generally, I think you can read the room as a teacher and go, oh, people are feeling this or they're not feeling this. And it always astounds me when I take a class that I'm struggling through, either because I'm unhappy with like the way the teacher is teaching, or I'm unhappy with the way the poses are physically making my body feel. And the teacher seems oblivious to that suffering. I'm like, where are you?
And that's why I felt so much anger, and I really had to rewrite it for myself, because I thought, who am I to say what's right and what's wrong too? Like, God, I gotta like, you know, level myself down a little bit sometimes too. But I get a lot of anger and rage, and what motivated me to become a teacher more than anything was like seeing people getting spoken to a certain way, or being in positions that they really, I'm like, you're gonna hurt yourself, and you're whatever, you know, and like, And so when I see that, I it's so challenging to be in the role of like well, no, not the role, but I am a teacher, and I look over and I'm like, you don't need to go that far. You're like hurting yourself, and the teacher's not doing anything to correct that situation. You know, and I'm like, how are you so checked out from what's going on here? Like, you know. Yeah. And that's where like language, I feel, comes into play too. You know, and like. You're only, you know, because sometimes I say to my students, I'm like, please, you don't, option, whatever, and they still end up doing it. So I really have no control. Like, overall, we don't really have a lot of control of what people are going to do.
No, I think, but I do agree with you that language is powerful. When I did my my mentorship after my yoga teacher trainings, right? One of the things that we chatted a lot about was giving students a framework for understanding their body. Right. Because as you were saying, and I agree wholeheartedly, there's some people who are quite removed from their physical being. Yes. Like if you told them they had feet, they would agree because they're standing. Right. But, you know, they're not feeling the grass between their toes or feeling the balance, you know, between the front and the back of the foot. Like there's no awareness. Yeah, right. And so one of the things that I try really hard in my teaching to do, it's not always a perfect science, but I try. Right. Is to give people a framework for, you know, what can I physically do? Right. Without getting myself into a danger zone. Right. Because even if I've done this pose before and I've done it exceptionally well in the past, or you know, in air quotes, because what does that even mean in yoga? Yeah. But every day is different. Yes, and I have days where I just want to lay in shavasana and have a nap, and I have days where I could do 100, you know, chaturangas and be fine. Yes. So if they're having an off day and they attempt, you know, the pose from a position of tiredness or exhaustion or, you know, mental blocks, right, then that could be a danger zone. Right. And so usually when I'm offering that framework, I'll say things like, you know, if you can do this with your body and maintain it for 3 breaths, right, then proceed to do this. Yes. You know? Right. And if you can't do that, stay here. Yes, exactly. You know, stay here. Right. You know, and then if they choose to go beyond that, knowing their limitations, then like, hey, they're a consulting adult, man. Yeah, like, you know, right. You know, some people can't tell me things either. That's true. That's true. I know, sometimes I'm like, I know my limit, but I want to push. I know. You know, like, and I mean, that's fine. Right. But at least I feel a sense of responsibility to give that framework. Absolutely. So that I'm not putting students unknowingly in danger. Yeah, right. And I have seen teachers do that in the past. I've even had teachers do that to me in the past, you know, pushing me into postures that I probably wasn't physically warmed up enough for or physically ready for. Right. And of course, you know, there's injuries that can be sustained from that. Absolutely, right. Yeah. So, you know, framework I think is important. Language I think is important. You know, language is important. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. And I think just giving people safe boundaries. Yes, right. Humans crave boundaries. Yes, they absolutely do. We don't know it. We may not like them. Yeah, you know, but we crave knowing. Like, what's the limit? Yeah. You know, what's the limit that I can do here? You know, safely. Right. And you know, I think people who are like athletes that are really into yoga for like the physical well-being, not just the mental well-being. Right. You know, they're going to push the limit because they're an athlete. Yes, absolutely. They want to be strong. Right. Yeah, and that's why I end up talking so much, or I do my best to talk so much in my class about just like, I don't really want to talk about physical stuff that much actually in my class. I'd rather just like really just delve into other things so that eventually my students like gain this understanding that they don't need to push so much or whatever it is, you know. And like I speak a lot to my experience in my practice, which was like mainly ego and external based for like the longest time. It was just like, how does the pose look, how do I whatever, blah blah blah, how do I like make it this way, that way, whatever. Am I the only person in the class that can do this? Yeah, you know, shit like that. And so now I use words like if the pose feels like sustainable for them for this amount of breaths as well. Like I'm like, okay, well, you know that like we're going to be here for about 10 breaths. Like, do you know, like let's find something that feels sustainable for you, a position or like whatever, a shape that you feel that you can maintain, settle into. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. You know. And I think, I think that's the other key too, is letting people know that sometimes yoga in itself is not about progressing, it's about maintaining.
Yes, right.
You're showing up for your practice, you're doing this thing for yourself, whether it's mental, emotional, physical, a bit of both.
Right, yeah.
And some days you're going to show up and you're not going to be able to progress.
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
Right.
And you just have to maintain what you can.
Yes, right.
And that's like meeting yourself where you are, right?
Right.
And I think teaching in a public forum, and I mean, this is probably an unpopular opinion, but teaching public classes where like you don't know necessarily all the people that are coming through the door.
Yes.
There is a certain amount of ego that is present in those public yoga spaces, because students are, you know, they're coming from a place of, well, like, this is my regular class, this is the studio I go to,
all kinds too, right?
People know me here,
yeah.
You know, so like if I want to have a day where, you know, I don't do as much or I don't push as hard, you know, there's a fear that people will notice that or see it, right?
Right.
And I have zero shame. Like, I've taken other classes with students that have taken my classes. Like, I've been a student among them, and been the person who like opted out, and like laid down or like took a breather or whatever, because it doesn't serve me, or really anybody, you know, if we're talking about setting example, it doesn't serve me or anyone to push through if I'm not feeling it, because then that just shows them that like that's the response that they should form, right?
Yes.
And I think how we lead in yoga spaces, you know, as practitioners, as students, you know, as facilitators, does set the tone.
Oh, absolutely.
For how your students are going to come into the space.
Right.
And when I went to yoga teacher training, we used to have a big sign in the front entryway as you came in that said, be responsible for the energy that you bring into the space. Yes,
exactly, right.
And
that can be taken so many ways, obviously, you know?
Absolutely. And I think it's, I think there's a lot of physical fortitude going on in public classes.
Right.
But I don't know if there's so much like mental and emotional fortitude.
Right.
And I think that's where it becomes important to explore like the lineage and the history of yoga.
Right.
There's a lot more to be said.
Yes.
You know, from, you know, the teachings of yoga.
Yes.
Than there is necessarily for, you know, how well can I do this? This posture, this asana, how long can I hold it?
Right. I want everyone to see.
How long can you sit in silence?
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
Exactly. Right.
How long can you give yourself a reprieve from like negative thoughts?
Yes,
you know, can you come into the space and actually let go of, you know, an interaction that maybe wasn't favorable for you?
Right.
Like those are the things that I hope students leave with from a class.
Right.
More than, I'm gonna look so hot.
You know, after my new outfit.
Right. I would way rather have them leave and have like a, you know, release a mental block.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, and that's why I find like some practices, of course, like they're all important and whatever, but I find that even for myself and what I see in like students or just people, that the yin class is one of the more challenging ones for people. Even if the pose doesn't feel obviously like it's overly physically challenging, but it's a really difficult class. Like, you know, I went to a yin class, you know, a couple months ago, and I'd actually never been to a class where the teacher was like, okay, 8 minutes. We're doing the pose for 8 minutes, and I was like, what the fuck? You know, I was like, I know this is a thing, but I was like, oh god damn, like, you know, like, and so, but I saw people, and for me, I was like, okay, mental game, like, I'm like, I gotta like be on my mental game for this then. But I saw like there was a lot of people that within like 20, 40, whatever seconds, and like fidgeting the whole time for the 8 minutes, they were like moving around, and I was like, see, there's like this part of like working to practice just like not only presence, but this like your contentment in your, you know, santosha practice. You're like, okay, well, can I just be contented here? Can I like really just be still? Can I be with my thoughts? What's making me need to move? Yeah, right, you know. And like, what do you then like, can you delve a little deeper and like face yourself? Why do you feel like you need to keep busy and you can't just be?
Yin is a really it's actually, in my opinion, one of the harder classes to teach very skillfully.
Yes, it is.
Because you're holding the poses for a long time. you want to set the students up for success physically so
Yeah.
that they can
Right.
maintain it without pain,
Right.
you know, for that length of
Well, you wanna,
time.
like entertain them in a way, you know what I mean? Right.
And then you're also trying to kind of guide them into each pose, or at least in the good yin classes I take, or the classes that I left feeling great afterwards.
Yeah.
You know, the teacher talked us into each pose in such a way that I was able to let myself settle.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's different for each person.
Yeah, that's true.
But I do find that yin is a class I do not go to a lot.
Right,
I struggle.
right.
I struggle with the
too.
fidgeting.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah.
That is a mental game for me as well.
Right.
And I actually stay away from teaching it, mostly because I don't feel that I have the skill set to do that. I am much more comfortable
Right.
in a faster paced setting.
Right.
You know, where I can speak a little bit more openly. I find yin to be a very peaceful, kind of quiet class, and I have a hard time being quiet.
Right,
as a teacher.
yeah, I can understand that. Right.
I want to talk the whole time.
Yes, right.
Which is a practice for me too. Sometimes I have to,
Reel
reel myself in and go, okay, do they need to know that, or can I just let them
that
be
happens
with their
to me
breath?
a lot too.
Yeah, Can I just let them feel their breath for a few, rounds here without my voice? You know.
Right, having to fill the silence too, you know.
Yeah.
I find like every time I start a class, I'm like relatively like, no matter what the class, vinyasa, whatever it is, you know, I'm like, okay, my voice like goes down, I'm whatever, you know, I become this thing. And then by the end or the middle of the class, I start like, I get a little funny again, I get a little zesty again, whatever. And then sometimes it happens in yin practice as well, and I'm like, good God, like, you know, like Whitney, like, it's not the time, you know.
Yeah.
And so it's challenging sometimes with yin.
Yeah, I think, and I mean, I think it also, I think it behooves us as yoga facilitators to know our strengths and weaknesses. I mean, not that a weakness is necessarily a bad thing either, but knowing what I think I have to offer and what is probably not mine to offer.
Yeah, true.
You know?
Right.
You know, I would never facilitate, you know, a yin class knowingly or like accept that as like a regular offering, because that's just not not my skill set.
Yes, right.
So even if it were offered, and I mean, I've had that happen before with studios where they're like, hey,
do you want to teach this?
Do you want to teach this specific type of class? And and I'm like, you know what, like, not really. Like, I don't feel like I have enough training in that specific area. Or, you know, I once also had a class offered to me that was supposed to be specifically like a donation class for BIPOC people.
Okay.
And I turned it down.
Right.
Because even though I'm Indigenous, and I'm like on my own journey here, I felt like that would be taking a seat away from somebody who is more connected and also is identifiable as a BIPOC person. Like, to me, it would look like just another white lady leading an offering for BIPOC people, which just did not resonate with me. And, you know, I made suggestions to the coordinator. I said, hey, like, we got tons of South Asian teachers. We've got Black teachers. We've got, you know, we've got Islamic teachers. We've other people who teach here,
of course,
who would better speak
to
that experience than I would.
Right.
So trying to put the lens where it rightfully should belong.
Yes, right.
Instead of taking away more opportunities.
Well,
that probably, you know, should have been offered in the first place
to this person. And that, like, you know, reminds me of when we were talking earlier about, like, unfortunately, but, you know, using our whiteness to, like, aid in helping someone else, you know, and being able to, like, support something because, yes, it was, like, given to you in that time, and you know, lucky enough you were like, no, you know, it's a beautiful thing because not a lot of people would end up doing that, right? And then using that, you know, to be like, here, let's change the focus, like, take it over this way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, and having those, and I will say, you know, kudos to that studio. I mean, I'm not naming anybody because obviously not looking for a lawsuit here, but
not today.
not today, Susan. But they did take it well. Like, it wasn't like they were like, how dare you tell us we're wrong? Like, you know, they were like, hey, new perspective gained.
Right.
We weren't thinking about it
right. We don't
from
know,
that
we don't
perspective.
know. Yeah. Right.
And you're right. We will reach out to some of these other teachers
Right.
who are probably better suited
For
in that
the-
lens.
yes,
And I
right.
was like, cool. You know, like, at least they were open to that conversation. Because I've
Yes.
had a lot of studios that were not safe spaces
Yes.
to have those
Yes.
conversations.
Right.
So,
right.
you know, good for them for...
Like being open to that.
Being
suggestion,
open, yeah.
And like understanding where they may have went wrong, even though they weren't
Yeah.
intending to go wrong.
No,
obviously,
and I
you know?
mean, that's something that I think is important, and I think maybe, well, hopefully all of us learned, you know, during the pandemic and sort
Right.
of the rise of the Black Lives Matter, you know, protests
Yes,
and
yes.
the death of George Floyd was
Right.
intentions versus impact.
Yeah. Right.
You know, your intention might be really great.
Of course. Yeah.
You have
For
all the
most part,
best
yes.
intentions.
Right.
But the impact ends up being something else.
Yes.
Maybe something you didn't plan.
Right.
And so can we be aware of that impact and like own it?
Yeah.
and be
right.
accountable for it and
Right.
go, okay,
Right.
like we misstepped here and
Yeah.
how do we make it right?
Right. Well, and be humble enough to know, like, okay, then I made that
I
error.
own this. This is
Yes.
my mistake, and
Right.
and I'm gonna fix it however I can,
Right.
or I'm gonna correct myself, or
Right.
you know, be
Right.
different in the space moving forward.
Yes.
You know, versus saying, well, that's not what my intention was.
Yeah. Right.
Cool story, bro.
Yeah. Exactly. You know, we used that excuse many years ago. It's still not. We don't make it up for it. That's not an apology. You know.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
That's not an apology, and that's
No.
not accountability. That's,
No, it's not.
That's denial.
Right. Right.
So I think it's important to have that ownership, especially in a space that wasn't cultivated by white people.
Right. Yeah, no kidding. Right.
Really?
Exactly, you know. And like in that too, like I think about how my teachers always said, like, you can't dedicate that you're going to be a safe space, because you can't be like a safe space for everybody. But they said that you can, like, you know, work to be a safer kind of space, you know, for the, but you know, you use your language, whatever. And I feel as though if you were to put together like a BIPOC class with a white, you know, presenting person, then instantly you're not really creating a safe space for those students just from the get-go. Never mind what the language the teacher uses, whatever. And even in you personally turning down a class that you don't feel qualified enough to teach, whatever, from you know the gate, you're instantly then knowing that you're not going to be able to like create a safe space for somebody, you know. So it's like you could do whatever you want in the moment, but it's like, no, I'm not gonna be the best person for that.
Yeah.
I can't you know, honor these people the way that they need to be honored.
And I think it's important too to think about, and I mean, this is maybe just like the most basic stuff that like my grandma taught me as a kid, you know, which is like, how would you want to feel in the space?
Yep.
I mean, I will never know what it's like to, you know, be a Black woman living in America and having the fears that go with existing in that system.
Right.
I'll never have the experiences that my own cousins have, you know, looking more Indigenous and being in white spaces.
Yeah.
But I can listen to
Right.
what they're saying.
Yes.
And I can go, okay, if I were in their shoes, how would I feel showing up to a class that's supposed to be a safe space for me?
Yes.
And I get in there and there's a white lady leading the class. Or somebody who looks white, even if they're not. You know?
Right.
You know, or even if they're not predominantly. Then, you know, the feeling that I would have would be like a sense of betrayal, right? A sense of being conned or scammed into being told that it was something it wasn't.
Right.
And like, that's not a feeling I think any teacher or any human really wants to give another human.
I feel like if I was like even like fully identifiable as a person of color, I would be like, you know, all just another fucking colonized moment, you know? Like, I'm just like, these fuckers, like,
yeah, exactly.
Right.
Like, it's not, you know, if you're committed to doing the work, then sometimes that does mean, like,
facing that and stuff.
And missing out. Like, you know what? I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable with missing out, man. Like, everybody can use that extra money teaching that class. Like, having a weekly offering added to the schedule, that's exposure. Like, you know, for somebody who's trying to make a go of it, like, that's a big loss.
Yes,
But if you're committed, then you're committed. That means you do it all the way.
Right.
And you do what you said you're gonna do. You know, which is, you know, the commitment that I made when I said that I wouldn't take up space where, you know, space should be shared.
Yes, right.
And sometimes it it bugs me when I see studios who are not, honoring that same commitment.
Right.
There's still studios that don't even do like basic land acknowledgements.
Yes.
Or things like that. And I mean, again, it's so hard because, again, white passing. So like I show up and I'm like, hey, where's your land acknowledgement, bro?
Right.
And I mean, it would be much better if you gave the land back, but I know you're leasing this joint, so you probably don't have that power.
Yeah, right.
To actually offer the land back.
Right.
But it would be nice if you at least acknowledge whose
yes.
stolen land you're on.
Right. Well, especially at this stage, like we're all aware.
None of this.
No
and
excuse.
I mean, if you're posting, pictures of every child matters on your Instagram page, then like your land acknowledgement, where is it? Like,
right.
I want to see.
Yeah.
I want to see participation and engagement, and I think a lot of people in westernized yoga think that yoga is not political.
Right, I've had this conversation before.
And yoga absolutely is political, and it has a history of being political. Right. It has a history of rebellion. Anybody who's studied, the history of yoga knows and is aware of that.
Right.
And I think that yoga is supposed to be
a
voice for change.
Right.
It's how we show up in our community.
Yes.
It's how we cultivate community.
Yes.
And bring awareness. So
right.
I think the class you took was like on like International Yoga Day or
right.
Shit.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, I think it was.
But I used that space because the day before had been Indigenous Peoples Day.
Yeah, right. I think it's the same day.
Yeah, I think it's the
same day because it's the same day as solstice. It's like a lot of shit at once.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. Right. You're right. I think you're correct. And I remember, like, I'm not talking about International Yoga Day.
Yeah.
Like,
right.
I'm Indigenous. Like, we're gonna tell a creation story. Like, we're gonna connect here.
Right.
And like talk about whose land we're on, and like what this means, to a colonized country.
Right. Well, if anything needs sometimes a bit of a bigger and higher platform, it's Indigenous knowledge and what have you, and acknowledging that, because yoga is just like huge.
And I mean, International Yoga Day was also created by a leader in India that I think a lot of South Asian people take issue with. Like there's a history of like capitalism there and colonization. I don't think it was like done with the intention that people think it was done with.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, not to say I'm an expert on the matter, but in listening to what my South Asian friends and like fellow practitioners had to say, I was like, okay, so like this isn't as cool as white people think it is. And then I was like, okay, now I know not to like get hyped up about this because it actually means something different.
Yes.
And so it's also listening.
Yeah, well,
listening to what people have to say.
Right. Yeah, it's nice to hold the space for anybody who's actually acknowledging even just Indigenous existence, which sounds like so ridiculous to say, but I'm like, it's just like I feel like there's such a disconnect there. There's not even enough that there's like acknowledging that this has even happened to people.
Oh man, I graduated in 2006 from high school.
Right.
And I mean, I was in grade 6 in 1996.
Okay, yeah.
That was the year the last residential school closed in Canada.
Right.
So I mean, realistically, when you look at my family's history and lineage, as well as like those of our outlying family, it's really like a roll of the dice.
Yeah, right.
That we weren't.
Yeah, right.
In a residential school. Like,
right.
It's really...
That's so true, actually.
There's a chain reaction of events that occurred that spared my mom and her siblings from residential school. Right. One of those being my grandma losing her status.
Right. And what would it... If somebody doesn't know, what would it mean to, like... What does status mean, and what would it mean to lose your status?
Status... You know what? I have a jaded view of status because I feel like status is just
like
another
colonized.
It is.
Yeah, it's like the caste system in India.
Exactly.
It's
the same. And it's because it was created by colonizers and not by Indigenous people. It's like a way of the Canadian government.
Right.
Allocating who's owed what.
Did they give you like a number? Are you like a number?
Oh yeah, you get a number. You get a number.
Right.
Yeah, we all have a number.
Right. Okay. So having status means
you're allotted a certain amount. Like, I mean, people equate it to like getting everything for free.
Okay.
That's like the most common myth.
Hear that? Yeah.
Right. It is a myth.
Right. Okay.
You know, you are allocated certain things within your reservation.
Okay.
But it's not like I just go anywhere and get free shit. Like, here's my card.
Right.
Give me these groceries for free.
Right.
Show up at the college. I want my bachelor's degree for free.
They're like,
absolutely not. Yeah. That's not quite how it works.
Right.
You know, there's certain programs and stuff that can be run on reserve that you may be eligible for, you know, to take at a lower cost or for free.
Okay.
But I mean, it's not like I get to go and attend, you know, UBC for free. That's not, you know,
that's not how that works.
That's very limited.
Okay.
And you know, and it's you're still subject to all of the same entry requirements that any person would be. Okay. Like, it's not like, oh, you're Indigenous.
Right.
You failed all of these classes, but you get this bachelor's degree. Like, it's not. It doesn't work that way.
You have status.
Yeah. It's not as. I don't want to say it's not special, because I mean, to me right now, there's something that I'm still going through internally, like just as a human, as a person right now, which is that my status did initially mean something to me when I had it returned to me, just because for me it felt like a reclamation of something that was lost. Yeah. But I know wholeheartely that it doesn't mean that. It means that the government can now identify me as an Indigenous person. So but
in some ways it would maybe be better to not
I mean,
you know, and
I think it's tricky, because there is a part of me that, as a white passing person, struggled with being able to feel Indigenous or say like I am Indigenous because of that lateral violence, right? Like that well, you're not dark enough, or you're not, you don't look Indigenous, or your family wasn't raised on reserve, so therefore, you know, so it's there's a shame that's tied to that from not being eligible, or not having that opportunity, and you know, having my status returned initially was sort of like, wow, like finally, like some recognition for like all of this journey, that I've been on. But I also know that like true Indigenous practices don't recognize things like blood quantum, or
that is.
It's like the percentage of your blood that is Indigenous versus the non-percentage. So like your lineage, if you're like 38% Indigenous, right. You know, true Indigenous practices, like we look at family lines, right, and we look at who's committed to the community, and who's, you know, who's showing up, and who's honoring and doing the best they can to be humble and have knowledge, and everything is about being in relationship with each other, with the land, you know, with what's going on in the world, and you know, status is just another identifier, so the only difference here, you know, when my grandmother lost hers, was that in that circumstance, at least to my understanding, this is all the history we have,
and I you never know the full truth with those situations.
I wasn't there, wasn't alive yet. But in her circumstance, essentially once she married my grandfather, she was stripped of her status, and when that occurred, that also meant that she was stripped of her ability to live on reserve.
Okay. That's what I thought too. Yeah.
And in some parts of Canada, this also meant that you couldn't even visit the reserve. So like if you had family there, you couldn't go back.
But it's just like continuing, like, you know, taking people away from their families and from whatever, you know, it's just like.
The Indian Act was just a double down on residential schools, really.
Yeah, no shit.
It was just more hoops and barricades to try and get through, right? To see your family or be with your family.
Right.
You know, and seeing, you know, my grandma, I think, learned from that experience that her proximity to being Indigenous wasn't helping her.
Okay. Yeah. See that? Yeah. That's how
So-
I feel a little bit. I'm like, wait a minute. Like,
So she worked really hard. I was kind of mentioning before, like my family's got that like power through
Yeah.
trauma
Yeah.
response.
Yeah,
like we're
yeah,
like the house is on fire. We're just gonna keep shoveling. We're just gonna keep we're gonna keep doing this.
Right.
We're gonna get the garden hose. Like
Right.
we're gonna do our best.
Yes. It doesn't seem to be working. Just keep going.
Yeah, just keep going. Yeah, we're gonna keep going till the roof falls on
Right.
us. And my grandma, was very much like. My grandpa was really white, obviously Lithuanian.
Right.
At that time, I think they were still part of like the USSR. So like he's like a
Damn.
yeah. So he was very like white, blonde,
right.
very blue eyes.
Yeah,
very,
blue. I was gonna say blue eyes.
Yeah,
Yeah, right.
very very German-esque.
Right.
Yeah. And to her benefit, that kind of allowed her, I think, to like at that time anyway,
Right.
walk in white circles
Yes.
and
Right.
have that proximity to whiteness that essentially she learned
Yes.
made her safe,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because screaming on the mountaintop in like the 1960s that you were Indigenous
Right.
was a death sentence for somebody who
Right.
was removed from their reserve, had no access to their family, had no
Right.
access to resources, and had children.
So is this then another almost example then of lateral violence because she is safer among her oppressor?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I would view it as that. My grandma
I never thought about
even
that.
towards the end of her lifespan, when I was having more conversations with her, in anticipation of her passing.
Yeah, right.
And I mean, my cousin as well, who's done a lot of research on our family tree and is a social worker.
Right.
My grandma still had
Yeah.
hesitations to say like, oh yes, like this is where we're from. She had very little pride
Right.
in her heritage and like where
Right.
she came from. And I think that in a lot of cases, like my grandmother's, that was the success of the government.
Yeah, right.
Right? Like that was their goal. Their goal
Yes.
was to make us feel inadequate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like we
Still
wanted
to this day.
and like we wanted to renounce being Indigenous.
Right.
Because the more we conformed to their ideologies,
Right.
the easier it was to manipulate and control.
I was just about to say it's like one of the biggest cases of manipulation
Yeah.
in the world.
Makes you feel like you're bad, right?
Right.
It's no different than, residential schools being run by the Catholic Church and the Oblates
Yes.
and,
Right.
being taught that like their creation stories were the devil and, the
Yeah.
only person who can save them is Jesus
Right.
and all this stuff. And then these kids go back and have nightmares
Right.
about all of this stuff and they're traumatized to the
Right.
point where like they don't know what's right and wrong anymore.
Right.
And they carry that trauma with them into adulthood.
Yes.
Along with other unspeakable things.
Right.
And then people are wondering why we have populations that turn to alcoholism
Yes.
or
Yes.
drug abuse
Yes.
or other like avoidance tactics
Well,
from trauma.
You've been ripped of everything you thought was true about yourself and your family and like your inner being and your way of life or whatever, and told that not only that it's bad, but that like you're completely removed from it. So you're like removed from your being so much that like then in that trauma response you would turn to things like drugs.
Yeah, and not only that, but you're told that essentially you deserve it.
Right.
There's a level of like you deserve what's happening to you. And and sometimes I'm not gonna lie, sorry if I get like a little teary for a sec. But sometimes like I'll look at my son.
Right.
And I mean he's only 2 years away from where if we were in the residential school system, they would come and take him.
Right.
And I think about like his spirit and like how adventurous he is and how much he loves the outdoors and how he's happiest, digging in the dirt and playing in the water and, laying in the sand. Like that's his happy place. And to think about somebody, and I let him grow his hair long and, his ancestors couldn't. And, thinking about somebody taking him away and cutting his hair and forcing him into this conformed space is just, I don't know how these women did it.
Right.
And if they turn to alcohol to survive,
Right.
then I hold grace for them,
Yes.
because I would probably
Yes.
do
The
the
same.
exact
Right.
same thing.
Yes.
I don't know if I could go every day not knowing,
Right.
you know, if my son was going to come home, and even thinking about that is traumatizing.
Absolutely.
Like, you know,
Yes.
and to think
Yes.
that, you know, my great grandmother did that, watched her kids leave
Yes.
and
Right.
not know if they were
Yeah.
going to come back,
Right,
and if they
right.
were coming back, what kind of trauma would they be
Yes.
carrying?
Right. Yeah, all the unknowns as well, right?
Yeah.
And like, even what would that do to the spirit of your child, that you're watching, that he is so adventurous, he is so free, so this, so that, so curious, whatever, and like, yeah, how is he going to return? And like, you know, will he be better for it or not? Obviously not, but you know,
It's and then people wonder, like I said, there's always this really harsh criticism for Indigenous communities where, you know, drug outreach is present, and you know, alcoholism may have been a problem, or is a systemic problem.
Right.
And you think about an entire community, like not just one family like mine where, you know, okay, my son is ripped away.
Yeah.
But I'm living in an area where all of the children
Right.
are being ripped away. So it's like you look out your window and you see your neighbor
Right.
is also having their child taken,
Yes.
kicking and screaming. And now you have an entire community of essentially broken people who've just had their children stripped from them.
Yeah.
And like, how would your community function?
Right.
How would your businesses run?
Right.
How would your electoral systems and like voting and decision making work?
Right.
You know, all of these people have just suffered collectively,
Yes.
like a group traumatization.
Yes.
And we expected them to just like
Be fine.
power through,
Right.
you know, even. And I mean, it's no wonder that everybody ended up with different coping mechanisms.
Yes.
You know, my family ended up with the power through and deny.
Right.
Some families ended up with drug and alcohol.
Yep.
Some families ended up with, you know, verbal and physical abuse.
Yep.
There's a lot of different ways that I think people handled that trauma. And when there is no support, when there is no system to go, hey, you're gonna be okay, you're gonna make it out of this alive.
Right. It would be difficult to even hear that or say that at that time.
Yeah,
you know,
there's no light at the end of the tunnel. There's no hope.
Right.
And you know, every year you send your kid, and you don't know if they're coming home again.
Right.
And when they come home, who they'll even be, and if they'll know their language, and if they'll know their family.
Right.
You know, that in and of itself is traumatic.
No, it's horrible.
So, you know, for people who say that, you know, those things didn't happen, or they happen not as dramatically as people claim, or, you know, whatever falsehood there is.
Right.
You know, I can confidently say that even though no one in my family has specifically come forward with like allegations of like sexual abuse,
right,
or physical abuse that
right.
I'm aware of,
right.
I can still say that even just the act of being taken to residential school
right.
had an impact.
Yes.
So I can't imagine how the families were impacted of people who did experience those things.
Right. Yes.
Because if we felt it and that, you know, quote unquote didn't even happen to us.
Yeah. Right.
Then for the people who did, it's a wonder they're still here.
No shit.
Like it's
right.
You know.
Right.
That's a feat in of itself.
Yeah, you're right. So then in going forward, like what are some ways that maybe, you know, people can maybe connect with this? Do you any resources or any sort of thoughts? I know you mentioned that to listen a lot. So
I listen to, and I mean, this is just part of my own understanding. Obviously, you know, for anybody who has experience with residential school survivors, you know, it's not always the easiest, you know, for them to open up or to have conversations or to share their stories.
Right.
So anytime.
Anytime. You want to text. Is that what it said?
No, it just just talks to me sometimes. Sometimes it actually freaks me out. Like, I'll be alone.
I wasn't expecting it.
And all of a sudden it'll just go off and be like, I didn't understand. And I'm like, well, that's because no one was literally talking to you.
Why were you listening? Anyway,
so the man is listening to us.
Right, no, Shahana, always. Anyways, listening, it's hard to talk about.
Yeah, so I do as much listening as I possibly can.
Okay.
Whenever something is offered. So there's quite a few podcasts. CBC Indigenous just did one called Cooper Island, which is, I think, an 8-episode series on one of the most violently recorded residential schools in British Columbia.
Okay.
There's also another one by Connie Walker called Stolen.
Okay.
And it was about her father's attending of St. Michael's Residential School in Saskatchewan.
Right.
And, like, there's a book actually that was written by... I can't remember the exact last name. I think it's Beverly Mitchell.
I'll look it up.
Yeah, I could be wrong though, so let's Google that. But
okay.
She was actually one of the first books I ever read after my grandma passed, and her book is called They Called Me Number One.
Oh shit.
And it's about her time at St. Joseph's residential school in Williams Lake, which is actually where my husband is from.
No way.
And it was one of the biggest residential schools in BC, so a lot of outlying communities were transferring children to that school.
Okay.
And she kind of detailed her experience, the stories she had there, and then also how it affected, her community and her life moving forward. And it was a very good read. It's obviously, it's heavy.
Yeah. Right.
But she speaks really eloquently.
Right.
And she speaks with a lens that allows people to, I think, connect to that experience without feeling defensive.
Right.
Which I think, people who don't understand residential schools can sometimes feel.
Right.
Right. There's also a book called 52 Things You Need to Know About the Indian Act. Okay. which is also another good one. I mean, there's honestly there's hundreds. If you Google residential school system and books, I mean, there's tons of indigenous writers and authors and visionaries that have done the work and released that information.
Right.
There's one more podcast, just because I'm such a fan of podcasts. Sometimes I don't have time to read all the time, especially with a young one.
Right. Yeah,
that's how
I lured you into this. I was like, oh, I'm doing a podcast. Like, I love podcasts. Right.
Yeah, because I can listen to them while I'm driving, or when when I'm doing other things, or when I'm cleaning. Like, I don't have to be, physically sitting down.
No.
But there's another one called Thunder Bay. That was released by CANADALAND. Okay. And that one is hardcore.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And it talks about more than just, it actually doesn't, I don't believe it actually talks about the residential school system. It talks more about systemically the racism that Indigenous people face and how entire government sectors are set up to manipulate and control the outcomes for like Indigenous related crime.
Yeah, okay.
And that is wild to hear. Like, the statistics they have in that podcast are heartbreaking. To know that we make up less than 6% of the population, but we make up 80% of the prison system.
Right.
Like, that's
Yeah, when you see it like that, written down in front of you, you're like, oh fuck.
That's you can't argue with the numbers, right? Like, and I mean, you can't have a minority that small that is impacting crime.
Yeah.
That big,
no
right?
Kidding.
Like,
yeah,
that's
right.
I mean, the physical improbabilities of that are limited, right?
Right.
So yeah, that, I mean, definitely, I just think anyone who's listening needs to know whose land they're on.
Right. Okay.
That's like the starting point. Know whose land you're on.
That's the first one. Okay.
Yeah, that's the first one, and then from there, do your homework. There's tons of there's even movies and like documentaries.
Yes, right.
I hate Prime. I'm like not an Amazon person. Like, please forgive me for
Right,
saying
right,
this,
right.
but there is a ton of residential school videos and
really?
documentaries on Prime.
No way.
Yeah,
Okay.
they have a
Right.
ton.
Right.
They have like, I think they have like an Indigenous curated section.
Okay.
Yeah.
There you go. Well, that's helpful, you know. As
Well,
much
I
as
mean,
it's shit, it's got
They're
something.
killing the earth.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
but they're still honoring us as they do it.
Right.
As they,
give and take.
Yeah.
You know, get out.
As they destroy the ozone layer
No
of
shit.
the atmosphere.
Right.
So
Right.
we all slowly choke to death.
But that's
Yeah.
for another episode.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
land acknowledgements, and knowledge and education and, like, you know, removing ignorance and all that. Is there any other last few things that you think would be supportive and helpful for people to create, you know, safer spaces?
Yeah, I think if there's one thing I could say, it's to approach with a lens of curiosity.
Okay.
I think it's really easy in colonized spaces to feel defensive.
Right.
We like things a certain way.
Yeah.
And
Or think you already know.
or we think we already know,
Yeah.
or we have a stereotype in our mind's eye of like what that will be like.
Yeah.
And instead, I just invite people to get curious
Okay. Right.
about
That's a good
what that
thought.
really means.
Right.
And learning about even once they know whose land they're on, learning about that tribe
Right.
and like what they've gone through.
Right.
There's so much I've learned about my own ancestry and like the people who are strong in that lineage that I would have never known.
Right.
If I just waited for my family
To say, right.
to say or to figure it out,
Right.
for me.
Right.
So.
Okay.
Yeah.
All very helpful. Okay, we'll link all of the resources for people to check out. And all
Yeah.
that good stuff. Thank you so much for being here and for your time and sharing your knowledge.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You're very welcome.
Before we go, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the stolen land of the Coast Salish peoples here in British Columbia, so-called British Columbia.